Good evening. Everybody doing okay? Most everybody's smiling, so that's good. A couple of you aren't, but well, that's all right too. That's true, yeah. I don't know you well enough. I'm not going to make any comments yet. Maybe tomorrow. Well, welcome to Living Hope. We're glad you guys are here. I'm just going to pray because you're not here to listen to me. So we'll pray, and then Ed's going to come up and lead us in a hymn, and then Evan is going to say a couple things, and then Lynn will share with us. So let's pray. Father, we do thank you for a beautiful day. Thank you for the opportunity to come together. Our desire is to become more like Christ, to see Christ, and we can do that in different ways. So thank you for that. Thank you for this opportunity. We just pray that we would continue to grow in the truth, that we would continue to see you, Jesus, and become more like you. Just pray you'd bless each one here tonight, that they would be able to have a good evening, and that they would leave more like Jesus. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Good to see you all. I guess I ought to talk into this. Good to see you all here this evening. I don't know whether I need to say much about Lynn. I think many of you probably remember him being here, what was that, 20 years ago or something like that. And if you're younger than that, you're in for a treat. Lynn has a way of sharing interesting nuggets, and one you heard last night, you've heard it before, but I think there's just a lot of wisdom in it. And that's when he said periodically, he's asked, what do Mennonites believe? He said, only two things. Jesus meant what he said, and he was speaking to us. I think that encapsulates a lot of who we are. Because we understand that being a follower of Jesus is not about what we believe. Sure, beliefs, heresy needs to be looked at also. But primarily, it's about how does one walk? How does one's faith and one's relationship to God and to Jesus make a difference where the shoe leather hits the road? And that's what this statement is saying. It's how Jesus lived and how he walked that speaks to us because we are following in his footsteps. Lynn also said once, at least I remember hearing it, that historically Mennonites have not split, divided over beliefs and doctrine, but rather how one lives out their life. And think about it, when you think back, those splits in our area here and so on, it's not been a doctrinal thing. It's been about how one practically lives. Many of them centered around dress and that type of thing, but still, it's how one lives out their faith. I sincerely believe that when we stand before God, it's not going to be questions about what we believed, but it's going to be questions about what kind of faith we lived out in our life here. And I think we have tremendous examples in the people that Lynn is going to be talking about from the Anabaptist period, and certainly many of us can remember people that when we were older ones in the church and how they lived and how they walked. And some of us are a bit older now and people are looking to us. Paul said, follow me as I follow Christ. That means you have to discern when I'm following Christ and when I'm not. So that leaves me off the hook, I guess. But it's that idea of being a model and walking in the footsteps of Jesus. Lynn hails from Bluffton, Ohio. He's been around the world several times. I guess a lot of places are home for Lynn. They have two daughters, 4 grandchildren. Two have graduated from college. One is in college, or two are in college, I guess. Sounds like they're doing well. Lynn has been an itinerant stewardship speaker for a number of years. He was commissioned through the Mennonite Church to be an itinerant stewardship minister, and he did that for 3 or 4 years. Just got into probably more churches than any one other person has ever been into speaking, and he said he kept a list or a number, and he quit doing that after 200 and some speaking engagements. But he was up in this area in what was it, 2014? No, 2094. In 94, and he spoke. He was at doing special meetings at Naumburg, Krogan, Lowville, New Bremen. All of those churches were involved in that. And then sometime in there, he also went through the Southern Tier and Western New York. So he burned out New York again. So incidentally, part of New York is called the Burned Out District. I don't know if you knew that from the revivals and that type of thing. So you did it again. Yeah. Well, Lynn, we're glad to have you, and please come forward. Lynn said he's specifically going to be talking about personalities of the Anabaptist movement, not as much about what they believed and so on. Let's pray. Father, I thank you again that Lynn can be here. I thank you for the work that you have done and are doing and going to continue to do in and through him. I just pray that you anoint him, bless him. I just pray that he can speak your words and we can hear what you are saying to us. I just pray for your blessing upon him. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.
The green light is on. Oh, wow. Cool. I often forget to turn that on. Yeah, your words about splitting and how you do that, why we tend to split. That was just an observation of mine. It tends to be less about doctrine and more about behavior. In the old Mennonite church, you want to have another church, just change the style of singing. Go from 4-part harmony to what we call contemporary, and boom, you got another church all immediately. So haven't seen a set of drums in a church for a while, I must admit, but they're very common. I understand that, and I understand where they are. Okay, so up to now, we've been dealing with Swiss German Anabaptism, Zurich. Remember last night, Conrad Grebel and Michael Sattler, two very important leaders, founders, I suppose you might call them, along with a lot of other people, George Blaurock and Hans Hut, and people that we don't talk very much about, but we're also part of that movement. Now that's sort of the Swiss, South German and Swiss. I forgot my wand with a red light, but down here, that right next to that lake is Zurich, just south of that, and that's sort of where they were, down in there. Tonight we're going to talk about much more in the north, the Netherlands, and a little bit later than Conrad Grebel and Michael Sattler, actually about 11 years later. In Netherlands, the Low Countries, if you've ever had anybody been there to the Netherlands, yeah, it's a very interesting part of the world. I'm a boat person. I lived on a ship for 6 years, so I like water and I like ships. And boy, in Netherlands, it's hard to get away from water. I mean, it's kind of water everywhere. In fact, most of the land they recovered from the ocean. The saying in Holland is that God created the earth, but the Dutch created the Netherlands, Holland, simply by building dikes and planting reeds. Which, if you think about it, we may end up doing in this country on the East Coast, especially Florida. I have a photograph that you're not allowed to talk about in Florida or show anybody. It's water that's coming up the drains in Miami to the axle of the city buses. And it wasn't a hurricane, it was just a high tide. Interesting. Everybody wants to live next to the water. Well, guess what? May not have much choice. But anyway, again, so in Holland, they sort of drained out land, and I've seen some of that. We were there a couple times. They removed the salt from that land with a particular kind of reed that they grew. And And if you see the windmills, you remember the windmills pictures in the different places? And by the way, Martyr's Mirror, this is an early edition, a copy of the first edition of Martyr's Mirror. You're welcome later to come up and look at it. It's in Dutch. You're not going to be able to, well, most of you won't be able to read it, but especially medieval Dutch. But in some of the woodcuts that were put in by Jan Lijken, you'll see the windmills, these Dutch windmills. Most of those windmills were actually pumps rather than wheat grinding. If you ever get up to Winnipeg, Manitoba, rather not Winnipeg, Steinbeck, Manitoba has a wonderful museum about Anabaptist history, and they have a windmill there, an old Dutch windmill. And I've seen the pump was a screw pump, great big, probably that diameter, wooden, that was carved out to drain land, to pump the water back into the ocean. And that was a very important part of our history, Anabaptist history. For tomorrow night, those Dutch farmers were invited into Prussia, the Vistula Delta, and they drained really bad swampy land and made it very prosperous or very productive. And that created some problems, and that's part of the reason they went off to Russia. But that's for tomorrow night. The religious life in Holland at this time, the 16th century, was also very prosperous. The Dutch Catholic Church was strong, produced a number of important people. Thomas à Kempis, if you've ever read anything by him, and Erasmus. Erasmus actually translated the book of the Apocrypha, James, boy, I lost it there. John's writing at the end, Revelations, translated that from Latin back into Greek. And that from that then translation came the English translations that came a little bit later. Now the Catholic Church did not train its own priests. They didn't have monasteries, seminaries. What they did was since people were becoming well educated, and during this period of time, they would hire and examine educated people to be priests. Around the year 1500, there were 5,000 priests to pastor a group of 600,000 people in Utrecht. In 1950, there were only 800 priests for that same area, so things have obviously changed. So there were lots of priests around, and priests had businesses, and they collected taxes. They also had wives. When the unmarried pastor, Heinrich Hussmann, became an abbot of the convent in Selwerd, he also received the news of the birth of his son, and he commented, and this is written down somewhere, "Thus I have become a father twice today." You know, a father as a Catholic priest and a father of a son. So there must have been some humor there anyway. So nothing seems out of the ordinary when a 28-year-old newly ordained priest is installed as pastor in March of 1524 in the town of Pingham. Now, if you've been there and if you know the Anabaptist history tour, you'll probably remember Pingham, but that's where Menno was. Menno's father was named Simon, and he called his son Menno. So Menno, Simon's son of Simon, is where Menno gets his name. Now, what's interesting, what I think interesting, that Menno was rather honest about how he performed his duties as a priest. He said, and it's reported, he joined his fellow priests in playing cards, drinking, and other diversions. Not a lot of Bible study, unfortunately. And he wrote letter that his co-workers had read the scriptures a little, but he had never touched them for fear of being misled. And it's pretty clear, to me at least, that he learned Latin and Greek in his training in a monastery and was able to read the scriptures, but for the first 2 years, he says, of his priesthood, he did not. Then he began to hear the preaching and the teaching of a group of people called sacramentarians. They're talking about the Lord's Supper primarily, the sacraments, about the Lord's Supper being a symbol, not transubstantiation, that the bread turned into the flesh or the blood, the wine turned into the blood. And he began to thinking, wow, maybe I was misled. And so he starts reading the Bible for himself. And it is as they had said in the Bible, this represents me, Jesus said. Now, remember Luther said, hoc est corpus meum, this is my body. Luther took that literally to mean, the bread, is my body. Now, and again, the phrase we get, hocus pocus, the magical transformation of one thing into another. But Menno sort of took this fairly seriously and became a sacramentarian. still as a Catholic priest, and began preaching what he called an evangelical gospel. And in 1531, something happened that changed his life. He witnessed the execution of a martyr by the name of Schicke Schneider on the 20th of March in the town of Leeuwarden. This Schicke Schneider had been baptized as an adult by a believer, by Jan Tripmaker, who baptized 2,000 people in the town of Emden in the north end, all the way up on the coast. And that was during the activity of the Melchiorites in that city. Melchiorites were sort of radical, violent Anabaptists who had taken over the city of Munster at one point and chased the Catholic soldiers out, and the Catholic priests and the Catholic bishop. And they came back and retook the city in this rather disastrous thing there. Now here, Menno thought, what is this? A man being put to death simply by being baptized as an adult? Menno himself had baptized hundreds of infants as a priest. But he said when he read to the scriptures, he couldn't find any example of an infant being baptized. Now, I've heard some Catholic priests, and my wife, the radio station in our area, the loudest one at night at least, is a Catholic radio station. And they talk about the reason for infant baptism is because not only does that do something for the family, but it preserves the child's innocence if he might die quickly, that kind of thing. Now, Menno says, no, he didn't see that, hadn't seen that. And the other reason would be Paul, when he got out of prison, preached to the family of the jailer, and his entire family was converted and baptized. And said, oh, there must have been an infant in there. Okay, I wouldn't argue too much about that. But after reading the works of Luther, he decided he'd been deceived regarding infant baptism. And so Menno began thinking about, should he still be a Catholic priest? And then came the events at Oudklooster, the old cloister, which was a monastery out in the country near Leeuwarden, and I've been to that area. Couldn't find the remains of the monastery, but we did find a sign saying Oudklooster Road, so it must have been out there somewhere, where his brother Peter Menno was killed when he and a group of other people had taken over this monastery. So Menno says he experienced a total renunciation of the world and complete submission to the weight of the cross of Christ, and that date was January 30th of 1536. That's 11 years after Conrad Grebel and Michael Sattler had gone through the same thing down in Zurich in southern Germany and Switzerland. So then Menno left the pulpit and went sort of underground. He was probably in danger of being arrested. It wasn't safe to be visible. So he left the city of Whitmarsum by foot, headed for a town called Groningen. And if you've been on an Anabaptist tour, you remember the names of these towns. One of them is where the hidden church is. So Menno is now on the road. He's trying to get away from, trying to keep from being captured. His first writing, and there's a real nice big thick book, The Complete Works of Menno Simons. And if you don't have that in your church library, you really need to, because there's some absolutely interesting. There's theology. Well, Menno talks about theology, but he also mainly talks about how we work, how we live, the feet on the ground kind of a thing. And so he writes the first letter is written to this person in Munster, the debacle in Munster, John van Leyden. Then he writes the spiritual resurrection and a letter called The New Birth, and a meditation on the 25th Psalm. All this time he's fleeing for his life, because now the king had put up a price of gold on his head. One day, he says, he was visited by 6 or 7 or 8 persons who urged him to put to good use the talents which he had received from the Lord. It's a sort of a quote from Menno. The delegation had heard him preach, and they asked him to lead the newly gathered peaceful Menists, they were called at that time, by 1544, after this terrible experience in Munster. So he consented, he says, to teach and to baptize, to till the vineyard of the Lord, and to build up his holy city and his temple, and to repair the tumble-down walls. Now, after reaching this, he went home, and he sent the men home, and sooner after they had left, another one came, which is Obi Phillips. Now, you're going to hear of Dirk Phillips and Obi Phillips, 2 brothers, who were part of the leadership of this group of Anabaptists who were sort of refugees now, and they asked him to become in leadership, And Menno asked Obi to baptize him into his new faith, and Obi did that, and ordained him for the office of church leadership. Now, Obi unfortunately renounced his calling and left the church later, and so Menno never refers to Obi in his writings. But Menno began traveling back and forth across the breadth of the Low Countries, and some of the funniest stories and the best stories we have about Menno come from those times. Most of the travel in that part of the continent was by foot, although there were what we would call stagecoaches. You remember the stagecoaches in the Western movies like this, and the horses out front? Well, Menno is sitting up on the driver's seat with the driver of a coach when they're stopped by Spanish soldiers. Now, during this time, the Netherlands was under the control of Spain. And the soldiers ask the driver, "Is Menno Simons in the coach?" And Menno climbs down, opens the door, and says, "Is Menno in there?" And of course they said, well no. So he turned around to the soldiers, they say he's not here. And so the soldiers turn around and leave, which is kind of a fun story. It maintains Menno's ethic, of telling the truth. but I don't know, we never can quite tell whether some of these stories are factual or not. I don't really care. They're just a good story anyway. I mean, so one of my things is they say, "Miller, you tell a lot of stories." I say, "Yes, and they're all true, especially the ones I made up. They're the most true of all." So anyway, soldiers he got away with that, but somewhere along he met a young woman named Gertrude, and they were married in 1536 or 1537. We're not quite sure. But he didn't have a very stable married life, because he was he was kind of a refugee, somebody fleeing from authority. Menno says in 1544, "He could not find in all countries a cabin or hut in which my poor wife and my little children could be put up in safety for a year or even half a year." The Emperor, Charles V, had published an edict putting the price of 100 gold guilders on his head and promising a pardon for any crime committed by the person who delivered Menno to the authorities. It was difficult to harbor him. There were several people who were actually executed for giving Menno and his family refuge in their homes. Menno writes, in 1539, a very pious and God-fearing man named Tjard Reyers was apprehended in the place where I sojourned for the reason that he had received me, a homeless man, out of compassion and love, into his house, although in secret. A short time after this, he was, after confessing his faith, executed and broken on the wheel as a valiant soldier of Christ. Now, the most important book that he wrote, at least in my opinion, is called The Foundation of Christian Doctrine, first published in 1539 or 1540. There's 20 chapters. It's a pretty good-sized document outlining biblical beliefs of the Dutch Anabaptists so that the world would know what these people actually believe. The first section is called A Call to Biblical Faith, and this is what Menno is primarily concerned about, proving the biblical basis for this movement. It's not a social group, not social media. It's just a biblical base for people who believe that infant baptism is wrong, but to live following Christ is what you're supposed to do. And we would call that biblicism today, I suppose. Despite not being captured, and because of the continuing executions of people who gave refuge to Menno and his family, he was forced to leave the Netherlands. There he went across the border into Germany, and he settled in the province of East Friesland, in an area owned by Countess Anna, who knew the name of the menace. She knew his name, because in 1544 she wrote and issued an edict. Unlike Charles V, she wrote that these followers of Menno were welcome in her area, and because they were peaceful and hardworking citizens, and she called them Menists, M-E-N-I-S-T-S. If you go today to Scottsdale, Pennsylvania, there is a cemetery there called the Menist Cemetery, where the Mennonites have been buried over the last, I don't know how many years, but I've seen that sign. So this is the first time that we know that Menno's name has been attached to the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists, they didn't like being called Anabaptism because they claimed we've only had one baptism. What happened to us as infants is not, we don't claim that as a baptism. So our baptism was the one we had as a confessing adult. But they didn't seem to mind too much being called Menists, or eventually Mennonites. Now, Menno and Gertrude and the children, apparently there was a son who died. He had two daughters, now they have a sort of breathing space. Countess Anna is protecting them, and they're allowed to stay in that area, East Friesland. East Friesland is on, I can't point to it, but it's on the east side of the Netherlands. Okay, there's West Friesland, East Friesland, and West Friesland. Anyway, so he meets there a Reformed theologian by the name of John Alasko, who has been asked by Countess Anna to come and organize the sort of Protestant state church. And if you've been to Germany, you know they still have a state church. Churches, pastors are paid by the government, not by the congregation. Now, along with the peaceful Mennonites, now, there are also remnants of the more militant ones. You don't need to write this down. There's not going to be a quiz on this. Melchiorites, Battenbergers, and Davidites. So sort of three groups who were very different in their theology and their belief in how to follow Christ, much more violent, which was a challenge to these peaceful Mennonites, and that's what Countess Anna wanted them. Anyway, Menno had this argument with John Alasko about baptism and the incarnation of Christ and the calling of ministers, and they apparently have never agreed on any of that. Now, what's fun to me to read about is how they treated other people. In 1544, again, Countess Anna, under pressure from Holland, issued an edict expelling the militant Anabaptists, but allowing the peaceful ones to stay in East Friesland. So there was actually a value to being a peaceful person, whereas the militant ones who had taken over the city of Munster were expelled. And again, for the first time, 1544, this is where Menno's name is attached to the Anabaptists there. Now, then Menno starts on the run again. He goes to Cologne, down along the Rhine River, invited to argue with theology with some of the reformers, but he not very good at arguing theology, and that doesn't last very long. And then Menno and his family, again, leave. Now this time they go to Denmark. So think about this. Here's a man who sort of is asked to become the leader of all these refugee Anabaptists, now being chased from one town, one part of Europe to another part of the Europe. So eventually he starts getting in other arguments about David Joris, who believed, by the way, Joris said that the inner man was not affected by what the flesh might do. Oh, come on, we know better than that. But we didn't then. And there were some arguments about that kind of thing. The Davidites, they were called, believed that you could do anything you want as long as your head was in the right place. Okay. It's funny, it sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it, lately? Or at least in this country. But the people in the debate with Menno were trying to figure out how to get Menno, having been ordained, how do we keep him alive so he can continue to shepherd this group of refugee Anabaptists. Now, the next guy that shows up in the story is sort of famous for, he baptized more people than anybody else as an Anabaptist leader. Leonard Bowens is his name. Kept the names of 10,251 people that he had rebaptized. Now, his mention is named more than anybody else's in Martyr's Mirror as having baptized this person about to be executed, because the Holy Roman Empire declared rebaptism to be a capital offense. And that argument is still going, not as a capital offense. A friend of mine who is doing a lot of work with Menno recently went to it's called the BEM meeting, Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry, in which Catholics, Lutherans, Presbyterians, all kinds of denominations gather together. And he was told, as a representative of the Mennonite Church, he was told that even if somebody wants to be rebaptized, that is very offensive to them because it denies the validity of the infant baptism. Duh. So that was the point of Anabaptism. The validity of infant baptism was in question, right? But they are still arguing about that today. I think that's very interesting. If I was at the meeting, I would say, well, get over it. I mean, we're not going anywhere. You need to spend more time teaching your own people about what the scriptures say. Well, I shouldn't say that, but anyway. Anyway, there's a series of group of people, and Menno's writings, if you get his book, tends to be directed at individuals that he's arguing with, that he wants to set straight. Menno has assigned the task of pastoring people all over that part of Europe, up in Prussia, And by the way, Prussia is where the Mennonites left to go to Ukraine a couple hundred years later. When this is one of the examples of was Menno's feet on the ground theology. During the winter of 1553, there was a ship from England, a group of religious refugees, Zwinglians, who foundered, stuck in the ice actually, off of the coast of Denmark. And Menno went to the mayor asking for help for these people, and the mayor didn't want anything to do with them. So Menno and his congregation took up a collection, and they took money, food, and clothing to the people on the ship. And when it was possible, they brought those people into their own homes as refugees. Now, these are Zwinglians, and there's a huge difference between the Zwinglian theology and Menno's theology, the Anabaptist theology. But despite of that, those people were welcomed into those homes. And even though some of them were unappreciative of those efforts, they were still willing and glad to be in a warm place for that winter. At this point, Menno's health deteriorates. If you've ever seen, there are some drawings about him, and he usually has a cane. He talks about a crutch, a person who is a cripple, and he died in a sickbed on January 31st of 1561. Interestingly, 25 years and 1 day after his conversion from Catholicism to Anabaptism. He's survived by a daughter, one daughter, and he is buried in his own garden in Germany. One of the most perplexing questions for people like me, why does this runaway Catholic priest become so important to a new, not a denomination, a new collection of people who believe that the infant baptism and non-resistance and non-violence are sort of the foundations of a church. Not a particularly eloquent speaker or a preacher. Leonard Bowens, Gillis Van Auken preached and baptized way more people than Menno ever did. Baptized Hoopmeyer, others are better theologians. We don't have what you might call a systematic theology from Menno or anybody else in Anabaptism. But I think Menno's greatness lay in his ability was as a pastor, leading the flock. Not so much knowing everything and having all the right answers, but leading the flock. Okay. Now, what I think is very interesting at the moment, when Harold Bender wrote the Anabaptist Vision a long time ago, he focused mainly on the South German and Swiss leaders, Grebel, Sattler, Hoopmeyer, that group of people. Currently, a friend of mine, Gerald Mast, the professor of communications at Bluffton University, is working on the writings of Menno Simons. He thinks that Menno was much more important to us than we had previously realized. What he teaches and the writings that he produced, he's spending a lot more time with them. We'll see. I don't know how that's going to work out. Now, you've heard about this already. I didn't grow up as a Christian. I had never studied the Bible, spent almost 10 years in the military, in the Navy, was disgusted with what happened there. I went to Vietnam twice. What we were told was going on was not, it was lying, much like Iraq and a few other places. But again, I know that the military has to have a war. I don't know if you understand this, but a military career only lasts 20 years. And so if you don't have a war every 10 years, half your military doesn't have any combat experience. That's not a good idea if you want to have an efficient military. And you need to test new weapon systems. Okay, so I think that's just reality. But I got out because I was fairly disgusted with the lying that was going on. I was on a ship that was involved in the Tonkin Gulf incident, and it never happened. It was an absolutely bald-faced lie. We were never fired upon by the North Vietnamese Navy. Actually, the North Vietnamese didn't have a Navy. They had one old diesel submarine and a couple of wooden PT boats that they had rescued from somewhere. But one of them came out to see what we were doing one night, and one of our ships panicked and started shooting. But it turns out they were shooting at wave clutter on a radar screen, not even at the boat. Anyway, I got out, and so I went to seminary eventually, and signed up with C.J. Dix, Peter Dick's brother, taught a course on Anabaptist theology. It was a 3-week course that started in January called Interterm. And I started reading this book here, Martyr's Mirror. Here's the English copy of it here. And when I got to, we started with some other documents before that, but I got into this and I couldn't get out of it. I couldn't believe, what are these people who are willing to die for their faith? and you're going to hear some of their testimonies to the executioners, and some of what the executioners did too. It's not all horrible horror stories. There's quite a bit of humor, believe it or not, in this book. And I wrote a paper for that course about it's some very interesting. There's 832 people who stories of executions in here. There probably were 5,000 or 6,000 over those years, from 1525 to about 1575. After that, there was other kinds of persecution, but not executions. But in 32 cases, the martyr calls for God's vengeance on the persecutor. I said, "Now, wait a minute. Now, what are these peaceful Mennonites calling for God's vengeance?" In 32 cases, it says, "And thus God's vengeance is seen because the bailiff falls off his horse and hits his head and dies." So there's a number of those. And I wrote that paper, and I gave the answer because they believed that their executions were unjust. The ruling was that you can execute somebody who was a murderer or a thief, and they would say, no, we are neither murderers nor thieves. You can read that. There's a number of confessions of faith in Martyr's Mirror. But I wrote a paper I wrote for what's called the Anabaptist Colloquium, and I get quoted once in a while from that. It's not a hugely important paper, but it was interesting for me because here I am, a new seminary student. That was like my second year in seminary. I just couldn't get out of that book, and I read that book from page to page, cover to cover. I thought it was absolutely amazing. You probably already know this. The Martyr's Mirror was partly written by a fellow named Tiedemann Janszoon van Braght. Actually, he wrote only the first 412 pages. This book here, that's up there, and this one, these are both what you would call reprints of the first edition, 1660 edition. Tiedemann wrote, this is the book number 1. Tiedemann wrote this one, and it starts with Jesus, the execution of Jesus, and it goes through all early church history, all kinds of people who died because in the year 160, it talks about a person who was a martyr, all the way through. The second book, this one here, is the book where Tiedemann himself didn't actually write. He edited it because there are other martyr books had been printed by then. In 1560, 100 years before that book, there was a little book, and it's still in existence. The book is called Het Offer des Herren, the Offering of the Lord, and that talks about martyrdom. It was a collection of the early martyrs in the Anabaptist experience. And that little book is the center of this volume here. Tiedemann just took that book and put into the book he wrote, the Martyr, what was then called Martyr's Mirror. So we have a lot of, I think very accurate factual information about martyrdom. A lot of the information we have in Martyr's Mirror comes from court records, interestingly enough. People kept track of what happened. So anyway, let me continue here. So Het Offer des Herren, the sacrifice of the Lord, or the offering of the Lord. It's an anonymous, nobody takes, what you might call it, they don't take authorship of it. In 1660, then 100 years later, 1660, 1560, is that 100 years? My brain is not working very well. This book is called The Bloody Theater of the Defenseless Christians. And the name Martyr's Mirror then is taken from an earlier collection. Tiedemann died before this book's publication, those two volumes, but it receives his name as the author and the editor of the second volume, at least. The book begins with an author's invocation to God to accept a testimony of these martyrs, and then later he portrays the book as a precious jewel. He lays out the evidence for his premise that this is a precious book that we should pay attention to. And beginning in the 16th century martyrs are following an ancient pattern, he says, from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who endured hunger, thirst, and oppression, and then Moses, David, Elijah, and Jeremiah, and so on. In the introduction, Tiedemann explains the connection between suffering and the role of infant baptism. He takes great pain in this book to show that the Anabaptists did not spring from the Munsterites, the Davidites, the Melchiorites, and the ones who were violent and took over the city of Munster. Anabaptists, he said, exist in peaceful forms before Munster, but he claims that the doctrines of the Anabaptists proceed from the source of truth, which is Christ and his apostles. And that's the whole point of the book. The fellow Mennonites of the 16th century claim a succession of doctrine and martyrdom from Jesus Christ. Now, other denominations talk about a succession, apostolic succession from Paul the apostle down through the ages until they come to the particular denomination. Whereas the Anabaptists have always claimed a succession of martyrdom. The first martyr was Jesus, and then stoning of Stephen, and then they go on in the books describing the succession of martyrs. There is also a confession. We tend to call ourselves a non-confessional church, which I kind of argue with, because in 1632 there was a confession drawn up in the city of Dort, and Roseanne, we're going to show you where that is at. Roseanne, yeah, that Dort confession, the Dordrecht we call it the Dordrecht confession. We're trying to find unity for a very divided Mennonite church between the Frieslanders and the Flemish. Now, if I had my thing, I could show you, but over here, Friesland is up in the north of the Netherlands, and the Flemish are down in Belgium, okay, in the south part. And they're very different. The Frieslanders were very much stricter about appearance and dress and the houses, and the Flemish were more flamboyant. And there was sort of a division there. And so they had written this confession, trying to bringing them together. And in that Dordrecht confession begins, it says, the account of the pious martyrs and witnesses of Christ Jesus who suffered during the first century. And again, he begins with the crucifixion of Christ. Felix Mons is the first martyr, that is Anabaptist martyr. Again, I think I said this when we talked about Zurich. He was drowned. His hands were tied behind his back or under his legs and pushed out the back of a boat and drowned in the river outside of the Grossmünster, the big church there. And then from then on, there's one Swiss brethren after another for the next about 30 or 40 pages. The martyrdom of Michael Sattler is found in here. The first Dutch martyr to be described is a woman, Wyneken. Let's see, page 400. I write all this down. Ready? Wyneken, a widow, daughter of Klaus in Monnikendam, burnt to death in The Hague on the 20th of November of 1527. And there is this interrogation before she is actually killed from a monk. Have you considered well the things which my lords proposed to you, which is mean your error? She says, I abide by what I have said. And they go on, if you do not speak differently, you will be subjected to an intolerable death. And she says, if power is given you from above, I am ready to suffer. Then they say, what do you hold concerning the sacraments? She says, I hold your sacrament to be bread and flour. And if you hold it as God, I say that is your devil. Well, what do you hold concerning the saints? I know other mediator than Christ. And she's pretty blunt about what she believes. I mean, she's also obviously thought through what she believes. And they give her one question after another. And finally, the monk says, it appears to me that you have fallen into error. And she says, I cannot help it, my Lord. To whom and my God, to whom be eternal honor. Well, what do you hold concerning the holy oil? And she says, oil is good for salad or to oil your shoes with. This is a woman about to be executed for her faith, and she's joking about what she believes. It's actually pretty good. I mean, I probably was the only seminary student to find the humor in Martyr's Mirror, mainly because I like humor, I like jokes and that kind of stuff, and so I can spot it. Now here, a little bit later, Elizabeth in 1549 is, what do you call it? She's arrested and being interrogated. And they say, what did the Lord say when he gave his disciples the supper? And she says, what did he give them, flesh or bread? And they say, he gave them bread. Did not the Lord, she says, remain sitting there? Who then would eat the flesh of the Lord? I mean, these are common people. These are not theologians. They're not trained priests. These are common people who have been taught, probably from Menno or another one of the Anabaptist leadership, about what they believe. And I was really fairly impressed by those kind of testimonies. What's his name? I can't think of his name. A theologian in Harrisonburg, Indiana, always claimed that Anabaptism is not a confessional faith. We don't use the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed, but we have confessions all through Martyr's Mirror of Anabaptists. One man who was tied to a ladder, flung into the fire. After a while, he cried out, "I am well done on this side now. You can turn me over and roast the other." He says, this pain is nothing compared to eternal death. Now, we don't know how close this is to what he actually said, but the idea that Thielemann von Braght wrote that down or took it from a martyr story, I think is fairly important. Here's another confession, and you're welcome to come up and look at these books. The bailiff asks Adrian, who has been captured, they're trying to find out where he has slept so they can capture the guy who put him up. They asked me where I had slept. He said, "I have slept well," said Adrian. "Did you sleep badly?" The bailiff says, "No, I will make you tell." And then they asked me, had I been rebaptized? I said, "No, I was baptized all right once." Remember, they didn't claim rebaptism. They were baptized once, right? The bailiff says, "Who baptized you?" So I asked him, did he wish to be baptized? The bailiff says, "Don't be ashamed to tell. I will tell you where. I was baptized here in St. Peter's Church." And so Adrian says, "If you wish also to be baptized, I will tell you." And the bailiff said, "I have no desire for it as yet." And Adrian said, "Neither are you fit for it." Okay, this is an amazing amount of, repartee back and forth between the authorities and these martyrs. It's just absolutely amazing. A little bit later, this Friar Cornelius is kind of famous in all of this. The Catholic, what you call the Catholic priest who interrogated them. Down here it says the Friar Cornelius says, "Oh, you cursed Anabaptists, I will also begin to upbraid with slandering the calves' tails." That is the rear end of a cow. All right, so there are some places in this edition, the Martyr's Mirror. This is a recent edition, where you see asterisks, ... and what those, when this was written, and what was it? Come on, brother, tell me, what year was this written? This edition, I think, is 1950. We were very cautious about what looks like a swear word, right? And so the Father Cornelius calls the Anabaptist a Shithauswacher, which is literally shithouse sweeper, an outhouse sweeper, okay? But what he's doing is he's labeling them with the name of an occupation, which he looks down on, right? He's not swearing. But in 1950, we don't want to put that in there, so they would dip. I thought it was kind of funny. Other things interesting happened here in March 28, on the 20th of March, 1558. 3 men were sentenced to death, and when they were about to be executed, the people they did such a bad job of it that the surrounding crowd rebelled and rescued these 3 men from being executed. There was some resistance to the executions. Another one was where the executioner would tie a bag of gunpowder around the throat of the person to be executed. So when the flames reached his face, his head, it exploded and killed him instantly. So there's a lot of very interesting details if you're paying attention. And don't get too carried away with the gruesomeness of some of the executions. The typical execution was to put a person against a post that had 2 holes drilled in it, and then a rope came around the person's throat and back through the 2 holes, and a stick tied together in a stick, and then they would twist it and strangle the person, and they would lose consciousness, and then the fire was lit. And there are also some executions where the person being executed prophesies that to prove my innocence, this stake on which you are about to burn me will sprout leaves in the coming year. Now, if you know anything about poplar or willow, and the Netherlands is probably one of those trees, and after the person, you can do anything to kill a poplar tree or a willow, but sure enough, in the spring, that thing's going to sprout leaves. I mean, That's just the nature of the tree. Anyway, the point of it is an enormous amount of experience went into this book. And it was brought here into this country very early, long before the Revolution, because it was reprinted at Ephrata at a printing press. They had a German translation. It was ordered for delivery without being put into a cover, without bound. And so they were, do you know what folios are? When you make a book, you get a whole series of pages, and then they get put together and sewn together, and then, okay. Well, the American Army, or Americans, the Revolutionary Army, George Washington, absconded with those folio sheets of martyr's mirror to use for cannon wadding from Ephrata, the cloister at Ephrata. I thought that was really interesting. So anyway, so what's important about martyrdom? Why all this attention to the executions and the confessions of the martyrs? Martyrdom is not primarily a history of the church, but I think it's an important part of our history. Mainly because, first of all, we know that suffering is part of the true church. Not prosperity, but suffering. Secondly, suffering brings about the reign of Christ, they believed. And thirdly, suffering is a testimony of faith to the world, is that we are willing to suffer for our faith. Now, I went to jury duty, and I was prepared to go to jail to avoid three things, well, at least two things. One, swearing to tell the truth. No, I will not. I will tell the truth, but I will not swear to tell the truth. Jesus said, don't do that. The other thing that I was prepared to go to jail for was to induce suffering onto a person. There are people in prison who need to be there. I worked as a prison chaplain for almost 3 years. There are people that if I saw coming down the street, I'd turn around and run the other way. They're just frightening. They have no control over themselves. They're mentally ill. They need to be treated and confined, at least until the treatment is successful. But the prison I worked in was basically run by the prisoners. Whatever the gang leaders wanted, the warden acceded to. They showed X-rated movies in the chapel after church on Sundays. Are you kidding? This is a prison full of men who have no women. They're locked up by themselves. And on Sunday evenings, we would go over to the other chaplains and I go over to the hospital and see who had been raped, young men who had been raped by other prisoners because of the movies they saw in the chapel. Prisoners, I'm sorry, I would do anything to keep somebody out of prison. Now, I know some people need to be restrained, but I'm not sure that would be martyrdom, just me going to jail. In fact, we're talking this morning about scams and about, you get these telephone calls now that sound like your children. Artificial intelligence. You've heard about this? They clone your grandchild's voice. I don't know how they do that, but they do it, right? Oh, Grandma, I've been kidnapped and I need to be helped. Or worst one is, and I've told my grandsons this, oh, Grandpa, I had an accident and I'm in jail and I need $3,000 for bail. And my answer is, hey, I've been to jail. It's no big deal. Relax. Take a nap. Let me know when you get out. I'll come and get you. No, I'm not going to send $3,000. And by the way, if anybody asks you for a gift card for something, that's a scam. No reputable business does business with gift cards. I mean, that's absolutely ridiculous. But anyway, the idea that suffering is an important part of our theology, or at least of our history, I think is true. Okay, any questions? I'm done. It's about time for us to quit here. I don't want to keep you more than an hour. I know. I'm careful steward of the time. Yes?
You said that Menno, when he stayed with people, they were persecuted.
Yes, they were.
But he ended up dying.
He died from sickness. He was never executed.
He was never executed.
No, he was not captured or executed.
It's not that they missed him, or it's God's grace.
That's the answer right there, God's grace. Because they were after him. Again, this.
What surprised me that the people he stayed with
Yeah.
got persecuted.
Yes. Yeah.
But then he never got persecuted.
Well, he was persecuted. Yeah. They were after him,
Yes.
but they didn't find him. Yeah.
Right.
Well, maybe people protected him. There's a lot of very interesting discussions from martyrs about, well, who stayed with you last night, and that kind of that language from the persecutor. Yeah.
And as a Christian, you tell the truth.
Yeah.
So then it's like,
Well,
so Menno did stay
yeah.
with me, but
Well, and Menno's response to the soldiers was, is Menno in the coach? No, they say he's not here. And so he escapes that one. So, and I hope that's a true story, a factual story. I don't really care, but I hope it is because it says something really good about Menno's cleverness, So, other questions? Now, I have here, this is the second volume of the first edition, 1660, okay? The 1560, you can find a book is about that thick and about that big at the Historical Library in Goshen, Indiana, if you ever get over there. If they let you touch it, it's a very interesting little book. It's covered with vellum, which is a skin, animal skin, and the pages are so supple you can actually flip through them. But it's in Dutch, in medieval Dutch. I tried to learn medieval Dutch. Even in the standard printing, I couldn't read medieval Dutch. What was it? Juliet Koitza, the wife of a professor, a Dutch professor, was trying to teach me how to read this stuff. It's pretty complicated. So you're welcome to come up and take a look at that. And the other thing I have is, this is the book, it's kind of falling apart, that contains two brothers, Jan and Casper Luyken, who did the wood cuttings that you see here. They're the guys who did the actual work to produce these woodcuts. And this little volume contains all of the woodcuts that were, and a few more that weren't actually in there. So you're welcome to take a look at that. Well, thank you for coming. We'll see you tomorrow night, 7:15. Tomorrow, by the way, we're going to do not anything different, but we're going to talk about Jacob Ammon and the Amish division of 1590. And I will read you the letter that he wrote in 1700, confessing his error, putting himself under the ban, and asking forgiveness. Now, the Amish all know about that, but very few Mennonites know about that letter. Anyway, I'll read that to you tomorrow. Again, thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. We do have baskets in the back tonight, and so if you don't want to carry everything home, just put something in there. Yeah, tomorrow, what's today, Monday? Yeah, tomorrow's the last night. Yeah, so come on back to see the grand finale here. Yeah, thank you. Let's have a word of prayer. Father, again, we're amazed at the grace that you extend to us. As we're thinking of somehow Menno staying one step ahead of the law for 25 years, tremendous protection and care from you. And I want to thank you for the way that you used him to help preserve the gospel message so that we can learn from it. Father, I just pray that you watch over all of us as we leave here. Give us a good drive home, safety, and a good night's rest. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.